Okay, so today I'm going to be giving a presentation on the book Make Garbage Great. It was written by Tom Sasky and Albie Zakes. Amazon states that this book examines the materials we use in our daily lives, shows how they impact the environment, and provides project ideas from recycling to upcycling and more to lessen our impact and protect our world. So first off, I just wanted to start the presentation with a quick animation.
This is the story of three plastic bottles, empty and discarded. Their journeys are about to diverge, with outcomes that impact nothing less than the fate of the planet. But they weren't always this way. To understand where these bottles end up, we must first explore their origins. The heroes of our story were conceived in this oil refinery. The plastic in their bodies was formed by chemically bonding oil and gas molecules together to make monomers. In turn, these monomers were bonded into long polymer chains to make plastic, in the form of millions of pellets. Those were melted at manufacturing plants and reformed in molds to create the resilient material that makes up the triplets' bodies. Machines filled the bottles with sweet, bubbly liquid, and they were then wrapped, shipped, bought, opened, consumed, and unceremoniously discarded. And now here they lie, poised at the edge of the unknown. Bottle 1, like hundreds of millions of tons of his plastic brethren, ends up in a landfill. This huge dump expands each day as more trash comes in and continues to take up space. As plastics sit there being compressed amongst layers of other junk, rainwater flows through the waste and absorbs the water-soluble compounds it contains, and some of those are highly toxic. Together, they create a harmful stew called leachate, which can move into groundwater, soil, and streams, poisoning ecosystems and harming wildlife. It can take Bottle 1 an agonizing 1,000 years to decompose. Bottle 2's journey is stranger, but unfortunately no happier. He floats on a trickle that reaches a stream that flows into a river, and a river that reaches the ocean. After months lost at sea, he's slowly drawn into a massive vortex where trash accumulates, a place known as the Great Pacific Garbage Patch. Here, the ocean's currents have trapped millions of pieces of plastic debris. This is one of 5 plastic-filled gyres in the world's seas, places where the pollutants turn the water into a cloudy plastic soup. Some animals, like seabirds, get entangled in the mess. They and others mistake the brightly colored plastic bits for food. Plastic makes them feel full when they're not, so they starve to death and pass the toxins from the plastic up the food chain. For example, it's eaten by lanternfish. The lanternfish are eaten by squid. The squid are eaten by tuna. And the tuna are eaten by us. And most plastics don't biodegrade, which means they're destined to break down into smaller and smaller pieces called microplastics, which might rotate in the sea eternally. But Bottle 3 is spared the cruel purgatories of his brothers. A truck brings him to a plant where he and his companions are squeezed flat and compressed into a block. Okay, this sounds pretty bad too, but hang in there, it gets better. The blocks are shredded into tiny pieces, which are washed and melted so they become the raw materials that can be used again. As if by magic, Bottle 3 is now ready to be reborn as something completely new. For this bit of plastic with such humble origins, suddenly, the sky is the limit.
Okay. And now I just wanted to officially start my presentation with a quote. It honestly spoke to me the most out of all the quotes in the book. And it says, "If I were a tree, I would have no reason to love a human." Okay, beginning with chapter 1, it's about plastic. The first breakthrough was made by Edward Simon, a German. He stumbled upon polystyrene, which is a material used in disposable utensils and styrofoam today, and it was an accident in his lab in 1839. Next, British chemist Alexander Parkes was the first man to intentionally create a synthetic plastic called Parksine in 1856. John Wesley Hyatt, an American, ended up developing it into celluloid, which is now used for what we know as ping pong balls. And in 1941, chemists at the Calico Printers Association in Manchester patented polyethylene terephthalate, which led to the plastic beverage bottles and polyester clothing we have today. So for plastic today, between 1960 and 2000, Americans alone went from gathering around 400,000 tons of plastic in the municipal solid waste stream, which is what consumers throw in the trash, to 24.7 million tons, which is a 6,000% increase from 1960. And then in 2011, 32 million tons of plastic made it into the municipal solid waste stream, which is, and then only 8% of which was recycled. And then landfills, ocean dumping, and incinerators are ways that plastic is disposed of, although they are factors in pollution. And then plant-based plastics are made from anything from corn to sugarcane and bark. Polylactic acid is a bioplastic of choice for companies that manufacture biodegradable cups, food containers, and other packaging. Examples would be the Frito-Lay Sunchip bags and the Stonyfield yogurt cups. And then the only downside to those plant-based products are that they must be taken and disposed of carefully and correctly, otherwise they will end up in landfills where they won't decompose. As the video mentioned, the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, it is one of the largest landfills in the world. It's formed by a current system in the ocean called the North Pacific Subtropical Gyre. Segments of the patch have been estimated to be about the size of Texas, perhaps even larger because much of the waste is located underwater, and then 90% of the patch is comprised of plastic. Then this was a statistic, or not a statistic, but just something to put all of the plastic into perspective that I read in the book that I thought was interesting. It says human beings manufacture nearly 200 billion pounds of plastic every year. There are 200 billion stars in the Milky Way and around the same number of galaxies in the universe. And I just thought that was an interesting tidbit to make things seem a little more real. Next, we have Chapter 2, which is metal. So for the history of metal, it's hard to identify precisely when the Iron Age began, but the forging of iron had spread from other ancient civilizations to the western parts of Europe by 1200 BCE. Hans Christian Ørsted isolated aluminum in 1824 and discovered that aluminum is one of the most common metals found in the Earth's crust, though it is very reactive and isn't found in nature in its pure state. He also proved that pure aluminum can actually be produced. And then in 1825, William Sturgeon discovered that electrical currents can pass through aluminum by coiling a wire around an iron bar. As for metal today, early civilizations used plants. Oh, excuse me. So 30 tons of aluminum ore just to make 1 ton of aluminum. Drilling for aluminum is a resource-intensive process and often produces a significant amount of pollution. 53 million tons of electronic waste consisting of old discarded electronic devices was generated in 2012, and there are actually mountains of discarded electronics in countries like India, Pakistan, and China. Most e waste contains a toxic cocktail of various metal components that can have long lasting health and environmental risks if left unmanaged for long. Hard metals, for example, steel, iron, and titanium, and soft metals, which is aluminum, are harsh on the environment due to the way they are produced, which includes mining and smelting, etc. Metals can be recycled. For example, when the aluminum foil on top of a yogurt tub is thrown away, a life cycle of a material that burned the environment to produce is ending. Here's another fact. 3 trillion pounds of steel is used every year to sustain our industrialized world, ranging from large scale to small scale, such as skyscrapers and micro-components in mobile phones. Next we have chapter 3, which is paper. And for the history of paper, early civilizations used plants, dried hide from livestock, and tablets made of rock or clay before the modern day wood-produced paper came into play. One of the most influential developments was when linen, a textile made from the flax plant, was introduced to the pulping process due to fibers that can last for years. The paper revolution reached the West in 1276 when a paper mill was built in Italy, hence the introduction of books, manuscripts, novels, and official documents. Johannes Gutenberg created movable type, which eventually brought about the first ever printing press in 1448. And German inventor Friedrich Keller revolutionized the paper industry in the 19th century by focusing on a single simple material, wood. He invented a machine that was able to mash wood into a pulp. And then paper today, for the first time ever in 1993, more paper had been recycled than trash in landfills. We consume hundreds of millions of tons of paper each year, most coming from wood. It's estimated that 3 billion trees are cut down every year worldwide to sustain the global demand for wood and paper-based products. Americans recycled 65% of the paper waste they generated in 2012, which is great. And then in the US, around 80% of paper mills have the infrastructure in place to use municipally recycled paper during production. But making paper isn't necessarily an eco-friendly process. It takes 3 gallons of water to produce 1 sheet of paper, and of all the trees chopped down every year, about 40% go to paper making. Another fact for you, interesting alternatives to making paper include denim, bed sheets, elephant dung, and coffee husks. Next we have chapter 4, textiles. And for the history, we have scientists studying the evolution of head lice into body lice have estimated that humans began wearing animal pelts around 160,000 years ago. The first textile loom it made its way from Asia to the West around 6000 BC. Eventually, in 1769, an English barber and wig maker, Richard Arkwright, invented a machine capable of spinning 96 strands of cotton thread at the same time. And then in 1794, Eli Whitney patented the cotton gin. Textiles today, in 2000 alone, the world's consumers spent about $1 trillion on clothing. Globally, about 7.5 billion pounds of clothing is landfilled each year. Cotton accounts for nearly half of the fibers used to make clothes and textiles worldwide, as well as 90% of all natural fibers used. Making synthetic fibers, which would be cotton, wool, silk, uses a lot of energy as well as relies on non-renewable resources like oil. The tanning process, when making leather, requires so many chemicals that the land around tanneries can become unusable and its runoff can pollute local waterways. And sheep farms tend to give off a lot of methane, as New Zealand calculates about 90% of its methane emissions come from its sheep. Cotton account for nearly half of the fibers used to make clothes and textiles worldwide, as well as 90% of all natural fibers used. About 90 different countries produce about 20 million tons of cotton each year. Chapter 5 would be glass. And for the history, the earliest archaeological evidence of man-made glass objects date back to 5,000 years ago. By 1500 BC, the first glass vessels were produced in Egypt and Mesopotamia, created by a core of sand with a layer of molten glass. Egypt, Syria, and other countries along the eastern shore of the Mediterranean became glass-making centers. And in 1843, Henry Bessemer developed one of the earliest instances of float glass, which ultimately are perfect for windows due to its flatness and uniform thickness. And Michael Owens enhanced this machine by creating his own, which could do the work of at least a dozen glassmakers at once. Glass today. It is estimated that 30 to 35% of container glass produced globally actually makes it into the recycling loop. To create brand new virgin glass, extremely high temperatures and a lot of energy are necessary, up to 3,000 degrees Fahrenheit, in order to melt silica sand, limestone, soda ash, and additional chemicals. Combustion created by melting raw materials releases carbon dioxide, sulfur dioxide, and nitrogen oxide. For every 2 pounds of glass produced, more than 1 pound of carbon dioxide is emitted. 16 pounds of nitrogen oxide for every 1 ton of glass, and 5.5 pounds of sulfur dioxide is produced for every ton of glass. 1 in 5 Americans say they would recycle more glass if there were more convenient recycling bins. The biggest issue with recycling glass is finding an efficient and user-friendly way to collect it and bring it to a recycling center, which I thought was interesting because I thought it was easy to recycle glass, but I guess I'm wrong. Okay, so wood, chapter 6. Archaeological evidence collected in South African caves suggests that our not-so-distant relatives may have started using small branches and grass materials for fire about 1 million years ago for cooking. And then during the Paleolithic era, there was an influx of wooden tools. Around 7000 BCE, people living in northern Europe began using wooden sleds to transport themselves, supplies, and equipment over long distances. And by 4500 BCE, large marine vessels and barges with hollow hulls made of lightweight wood allowed huge amounts of goods and people to be transported long distances over large bodies of water, which is the picture you see to your right. And then in 1973, Irvin Vincent developed the first lumber made entirely from plastic. It was made from recycled plastic, actually, for example, polyethylene. And then wood today, even simply throwing away wood instead of recycling is damaging. We could heat 50 million homes for 20 years straight with the amount of wood thrown away annually in the United States. Forests absorb more carbon dioxide than tree farms, and removing old trees to create a tree farm actually releases carbon dioxide and can take as long as 20 years before the planted trees grow enough to absorb meaningful levels of greenhouse gas. Forests cover 31% of land on our planet and house 70% of the world's land, animals, and plants. And unfortunately, We lose forests at a rate of about 48 football fields per minute. And lastly, deforestation in dry climates can ultimately result in desertification. The global market for wood is about $250 billion, and that doesn't even include the market for construction and industrial timber. Chapter 7, Rubber. History of rubber. Earliest example, around 1400 BCE, came from a game played by the Olmec civilization using a rubber ball. In 1735, Charles Marie de la Condamine journeyed to South America and sent a sample of rubber back to Europe, their introduction to the material. With the invention of the automobile around 1879, Brazil's small towns became busy centers of commerce as the demand for rubber increased. The seeds of the hevea tree were germinated and sent to different countries so they could join in on the invention of rubber. Rubber today. An estimated 1.2 million acres of land in China, Cambodia, Thailand, Myanmar, Vietnam, and Laos have been transformed for rubber production. By 2050, it could be 2 or even 3 times as much space. Today, 60% of rubber used around the world is synthetic. Around 80% of these synthetic rubbers are used by the automobile industry. The U.S. alone generates approximately 290 million scrap tires, 27 million of which end up in landfills, and 28 states ban whole scrap tires from being landfilled, which is great. Tires are made of a mix of rubber, petroleum, and carbon black, which is derived from partially burned fossil fuels. They add so much friction, tires add so much friction to cars themselves driving on the road that engines actually have to burn more fuel. This extra fuel is responsible for about 86% of the greenhouse gas emissions that tires contribute. And then burning tires can contain pollutants like polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, benzene, and butadiene, many of which have been linked to cancer, neurological symptoms, blood disorders, respiratory symptoms, and cardiovascular disease. For every million tires that are burned, 55,000 gallons of runoff are produced. And globally, we produce 23 billion pounds of rubber every year. All right, and our last chapter, chapter 8, on organics. The history of organics. It wasn't until the Neolithic Revolution over 10,000 years ago that people even began to understand and utilize agriculture, shifting away from the hunter-gatherer lifestyle. In 7000 BCE, people began to raise livestock and an early version of the plow for sowing fields. In 1701, with the invention of the drill seed created by Charles Townshend, food was beginning to be produced so efficiently that there were finally surpluses. And in World War II came with food shortages, which led to the post-war Green Revolution, which was a global effort to research new varieties of crops that could be higher yielding with genetic engineering. And as for organics today, we grow enough grain to feed every human being on Earth about 3,500 calories a day, while at the same time global hunger and starvation have actually increased. Normally, organic waste that is left to decompose out in the open will release carbon dioxide as oxygen is present. If it's not left out in the open, such as left in a landfill, it will decompose and release methane into the air instead. The international market for processed food products stands at about $3.2 trillion, which is about 75% of annual global food sales. And the meat industry in the U.S. generates 61 million tons of animal waste every year, polluting rivers and groundwater. The Environmental Protection Agency reports that this type of animal waste pollutes nearly 35,000 miles of river in the United States. And our last fact, consumers throw away about 36 million tons of food every year. About 40% of the food produced in the US, valued at about $165 billion, ends up being thrown away without even being consumed. And now I'm finished with my presentation, and I'd just like to thank you so much for listening.